My name is Tamara. I'm heading a program called Medici, which is a vocational destination for senior public funders, meeting point outside festival hustle and a lobbying protocol, organized as a 3-day reunion annually in different cities, discussing the challenges and the issues that the audiovisual film funding is facing. And it is attended by European and international funders once a year. And I'm very happy that it is the second year we are continuing this industry partnership with CineLink here at Sarajevo Film Festival and bringing some of the topics that are discussed in Medici to the wider exchange with the industry and some other professionals. And so here now we are going to discuss the issues that is really a complex and probably one of the most important elements that the funders are facing. And this call is Thinking Inclusion Policy, Funding and the Industry Shift. The idea of this 1 hour and potentially 10-15 minutes that we have is to go deep into the viewpoint of the funders and understand how do they see the inclusion thinking paradigm, what are the structures, agenda, target that is already in place, what are the issues faced on that complex road, and what are the challenges. And of course, in order to make this talk possible, I have to introduce wonderful colleagues, distinguished professionals coming from different territories. So together with me is Caterina Bolognese from Council of Europe, Head of Gender Equality Unit, Neil Paplow, Head of International and Industry at British Film Institute, Kristina Börjeson, who is the Head of Production at the Väst Regional Film Fund in Sweden, Natasha Bukar, who is very well known in the region in her function as Head of the Slovenian Film Center, and a fairly new colleague to the audiovisual sector, Fatih Ebi, who is the Diversity and Inclusion Officer at European Film Academy and who joined the team of the Academy probably 2-3 months ago. We will see, and I would like to first thank you, of course, for joining us, and also to ask you to see this conversation as a creation of a very safe space of exchanges, of actions and thinking that has already been taken, and let's see together what our colleagues in the audience can learn, what are the questions that you have, and somehow slowly but surely move towards the actions that are making our industry way more diverse in a mid and a long-term perspective. So that would be my wish, and now I would like to start with you, Fatih. And I'm going to give you, tell you a little story from Medici edition last year that some of the people here in the panel and in the audience attended. When we had a focus on inclusion agenda, and it was a rather complex and exhausting day and a half, I must say. And I worked together with a joint colleague, Temba Bebe, from European Film Market. And I thought that the way of entering this topic in Medici last year was to see like the personal journey and how comes someone suddenly, let's say, transits from existing personal, professional history and becomes a diversity and inclusion officer. Like 20 years ago, for instance, I didn't know anyone in that position in audiovisual sector. And I think that that brings a very specific, real and genuine perspective to understand what has happened and not to stay on a declarative level, but rather put faces and paces and biographies in place. So could you tell us a little bit about you, your background, and how come you have taken this post now at the European Film Academy?
Yes, thank you. So I was born and raised in Berlin to Turkish parents in the guest worker movement who came actually in the 60s, 70s when they were children. They met even in Berlin, in Germany. And that's, I think, is also already the complexity of the whole discussion of diversity and inclusion, because even Germany and the German mainstream society has a certain understanding of citizenship, belonging. I can just tell very briefly of my experience. I was naturalized when I was 16. I had my first German ID. I was super proud and going around, I was like, I'm German. And then the first, like my fellow schoolmates said, no, you're not. So, and that's actually how it's basically goes still today, unfortunately, the whole debate about belonging, citizenship. And that's also then transcending, obviously, to institutions. I'm coming from a very academic background. I studied European studies in Maastricht and then also had the Central European connection at CEU Budapest, so I have a very West and Eastern European perspective, and then came back to Berlin to do my PhD as cultural anthropologist in that area, especially migration, diversity, inclusion, and then the position at the European Film Academy kind of was open now due to the agenda of our CEO, Matthias Walter Knoll, who basically took over the European Film Academy in 2021 and who is very, very well known in the industry already. And he has a clear mission and agenda when it comes to the European Film Academy. And I did actually the last 1.5 years advocacy work for NGOs. So I work actually also at the NGO, combating racism and advocating diversity, inclusion when it comes to this. And that's how I basically now, with the intervention of our CEO in this, in the academy, because with me, a lot of people were newly hired. With me now, since June, 5-6 people started in different areas. We have an area of sustainability, but then also head of communication and partnership sponsoring. So, and there you can really see this shift. I mean, I can not talk really much about funding, but I can see that there's an industry shift when it comes to this topic, diversity, inclusion, and obviously it's an institution, the European Film Academy, representing European film, and actually also in order to facilitate debates on these issues. And for this, I can just say, also observing a bit now this industry, and that new perspectives and new voices are needed. And especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, there should be also equity. Meaning everybody should be dealt fair and have equal opportunities in this sector. But, and this is now to my other panelists where I kind of bridge a bit, because obviously the question is always about funding, and their new voices have to be heard, and that's basically then more their responsibility, I would say, to basically grant these opportunities very, because I talked with filmmakers the last months, people of color in Germany, but also in Europe, and they basically, the main challenging is actually the accessibility, because it's an institution and the industry itself has a very, very strong structure, and so it's and this intervention, but also basically to have, to grant new voices, new perspectives in this topic. And diversity inclusion and is very, very broad defined, also nationally. I mean, we're talking about Europe, so Europe itself is a very diverse entity, but then within those diversities, there are different national narratives, and certain national narratives are maybe stronger than other national narratives, but these diversities, these diverse perspectives have to be also respected equally and intersectionally.
I should assure you that those discussions been around for some years now, and we're not going to repeat what's been said many times in different panels. There's been movements such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, that have, let's say, inspired for different reasons the debates becoming really heated in the industry. So, but the idea of today is actually to see more into the practical side of it. And I'm absolutely aware that there is a huge gravity that goes towards those in the decision-making power, as it is often mentioned in our sector, who are deciding about the content, about policy framework, and with this they are allowing those marginalized voices being heard that are not naturally kind of included in audiovisual narrative. And there are territories that you rightly mentioned that are a bit more advanced for different reasons on that policy framework, and others that still need to define the approach and then act on it. And the talk today is to exchange about those existing practices. And I would like to start with the example of BFI. So Neil, if you could take the floor. I have a feeling that public agencies are very constantly asked to ensure the policy framework that is allowing new voices to come in, to have a certain criteria standard, and like really create internal structures as well as the funding criteria on the content side. And we often talk about the BFI example, which obviously is quite advanced in comparison to some other territories and has a historic reasoning of why. So could you make a bit of an overview how you are approaching this subject matter internally?
Yeah, and actually we are going through this whole process at the moment with a new strategy to ensure that what we're doing is not just embedded but expanded upon, because although we may be seen as being ahead, we're not that far ahead, and actually we still need to address some underlying issues also internally within the Institute to look at covert or subconscious racism and attitudes which inform decisions and challenge ourselves constantly. So what we're looking at as the BFI is we obviously want to advocate for workplaces which are more representative, and we want to do that through behaviors and cultures which are inclusive. And that means not short-term initiatives, but long-term interventions which can be iterated upon, learned what the best lessons and how to move forward, and then also data that measures them. We need to do that in conjunction and in collaboration with those underrepresented communities. Nothing about us without us is the mantra that we use. We also ensure that we consider intersectionality, because then if you start to silo the approach to diversity, then you're missing out actually on a wider issue, which is just a general one around how do we make sure we're being inclusive across that issue around intersectionality. And we ensure that we're trying to do that and show best practice to the rest of industry by what we do. So in terms of moving forward and what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years, we're having a real focus on equality around inclusion for people living with a disability. At the moment, they are severely underrepresented within industry, so we've got a disability advocacy group that we're working with to help address that. We also want to address racism, and we're doing anti-racism training within the BFI, which then we're looking at how we can implement that externally. And we're also starting to bring industry into conversations about how we can make workplaces safer. So we've just done a big skills review, and one of the things that we found was actually this lack of professional approach to HR within productions. We've introduced a well-being officer for the productions that we fund, but the industry doesn't have them. And if you're being bullied and if you're being harassed and there's racism on set, who do you turn to? And in a corporation, there is normally somebody that you can go to, but on a production, there isn't, and people then become exposed. And then you get that whole thing of people come into the industry because there's an initiative which says we're looking for more diverse people, and then when they're there, they immediately leave because it's not actually a safe place to be. So that's something else we're looking is, can we develop a practical toolkit which will help ensure that when people come into the industry that they stay. There's also a focus on the diversity standards, which I'm sure you've heard about before, which applies to all the funding that we undertake. So producers who come to us with a production need to demonstrate an approach to diversity around, and not all 5 aspects, it has to just show that 3 of these areas have to be engaged with: the story, the talent that tells that story, the people who make that in terms of the production, and how to access audiences, more diverse audiences. And we're looking at that in terms of how we can apply that across all the funding that happens within the BFI to ensure that when funding decisions are made, it's not just the funder that has to consider that diversity, it's actually the people who are asking for money that need to consider it. And the other area, like I've said, bullying and harassment, and also looking at how we can respond to the need from the skills review to ensure that we have a professional HR function on productions.
And when you say you are going through the changes internally as well, it's like the team of the BFI who's...
Yeah, and how we're measuring ourselves. And I think data is important, because if we do a lot of work and we can't measure whether or not we are becoming more inclusive, then how can we actually judge if something's been a success? So the initiative is not enough, it's what happens after that. So we're looking at setting targets internally, which, and also externally for industry, around 50% in terms of gender, 30% in terms of representation for ethnic minorities, 20% in terms of people living with a disability, and ensuring that all those are targets are adhered to. We need some way to measure it. And that's where we need industry to be part of the solution. And for us, this is an opportunity. This isn't a burden, this is a benefit. You know, there are people who, from diverse backgrounds, who are talented, who don't think this is an industry for us. And there are stories which we haven't yet heard, which actually hit a market that is financially viable. So for me, one of the most exciting independent films that got produced was called Blue Story. It came out of a YouTube channel by a grime artist. He self-funded the film, then Paramount got involved, and the budget went from nothing to I think it was $1.5 million in the end. It got released in cinemas. There were people literally fighting to get into a seat. They'd buy a Harry Potter ticket just to go and see Blue Story. It was one of the most successful kind of budget to box office successes, and that was the first time black director who knew their audience, who reached out to them, and that then demonstrated actually there's a business model which isn't about being, you know, just the moral obligation that I think we all do have, but actually there's audiences that don't see themselves on screen. I think that's something which we just need to recognize and address.
Thanks a lot. By the way, 2 colleagues of yours have been with us last year in Medici, and they really contributed a lot with the knowledge that we shared. Kristina, I would like to go back to our common times when we both used to represent Sweden and Georgia respectively in your image, and I do remember you as one of very outspoken advocate for the gender equality agenda. You've participated in many actions that your image took time into action back then, and you have this perspective also from a very important institution, Swedish Film Institute, under the leadership of Anna Serner, that's been really kind of flagging out 50-50 by 2020 agenda, but let's not frame it to that, but the whole, you know, prolific actions, debates, and some genuine movements that happened afterwards. So could you try to give a bit of a panoramic view? Where did that start, and how are you looking at that now with intersectional approach from your new position as head of production at Väst?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've been thinking quite a bit about it since you wrote your email, and because I started almost the same day as Anna Serner. That was in 2011, and at that time I wasn't head of film funding. I became that later on, but Anna immediately started. For her, gender was on top. Democracy and gender, that were her questions, really. And so there were a lot of initiatives immediately from the start, but they were not that much connected to the funding to start with. It was more of training and just also starting the discussion. Always talking about the gender equality in all different spaces where she were, and also where the rest of us finally showed up. But I think, because when I look in the rear mirror, she was so fast. She knew everything. And we were a little bit behind, all of us. It was like, well, no, it went too quick. And some understood immediately, and for some of us, I'm connecting to this when it comes to the diversity, because something happened there. But finally, we sort of all got on board. But I think now, if my recommendation to funds or institutions to do this is to get the people internally on board first, before you start the discussion with the industry. Because now, maybe some of us were okay prepared, some were well prepared, but some were not at all prepared. And we constantly went into discussions and arguing and discussing this, and we didn't really have the best arguments. After a while, we got them, but that was like the start of it. And I also think to do it in another way, to have a more open dialogue with the industry from the start. Now we were really doing it a little bit in the institutional way, and although I would say the Swedish Film Institute is not a very institutional place, but that was sort of the easiest and quickest way for us to do it. Maybe it also was a good idea because we got things done quickly, but the cost of it, I think, was the relationship with the industry and all the discussions that actually happened. And then when we sort of check on that, gender, oh, there are more issues we should handle. So then was diversity, and that was, I'm being very frank now and open about the difficulties that we had within the Institute. By then we understood that we had to start with the people working within the Institute, but we, not to go into details, we had the wrong lectures, we made it in the wrong way, and the discussion itself became so infected, we just had to put a break. We had to wait for, I don't know, a year or something, because there were people within the organization who were so upset about how that was done, and I mean, we all understood that that was not a good way. And then finally, when we were start it again, it took a lot of effort, and I still, because I talked, now I'm in the regional fund, much smaller organization, but I talked to my former colleagues at the Institute, and I mean, there is not something specific going on. It's a constant dialogue, but there is not an action plan. There are not really the way we did it with gender. And also to explain, we talked about it the other day, why gender also comes so easy for Swedish people is because we had a social democratic government for 40 years where all this going forward with the gender discussion was a natural thing within Sweden. So we were much more ahead when it came to that than diversity, where I would say we're really not very good, actually.
Thank you very much for your frank overview. We like it at Medici also. And I saw that Fatih was nodding because you saw that we've discussed that before, how challenges are also panoramic on the funding side. So I'm sure that there will be a lot of interesting encounters coming up for you. Natasha, let's look into the Slovenian approach, let's say, to the subject matter. I must say that when we've been discussing this topic with the team of CineLink, there's been an interest to see, to look into the baby steps, let's say, that they are taken in the region, because we said in the beginning you cannot compare it on a territorial basis, and you really need to have a very intersectional view from what historic social perspective that you have suggested and what are the actions taken. So I know you have a little PowerPoint to not follow but bring up.
Yes.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamara, for the invitation and this introduction. Yes, Anna Sena, Swedish Film Institute, Urimash were my inspiration to get into, first of all, study and research what is the gender balanced situation in Slovenian film and audiovisual industry. So in 2018, we made a study on all the history of Slovene filmmaking, and we, of course, publicly presented this study, which I treat and understand this was part of the presentation at that moment with our famous film director, showing on her left the male directors, list of male directors from Slovenian history, and in the right hand, very few women who managed to get access to make films in Slovenia. So this is very, I think, historical picture where it all began, and I treat this presentation as our first dialogue also with the industry, which you mentioned, like the lack in Sweden, but we already had examples of Swedish Film Institute and many more in Europe. So this is how it started. You can see from the lists how the results ended. So this was our, and this is some data, and this was the beginning. And this is where we started. We knew that we belonged to the region, to the territory where this is not an easy issue, and it's not a lot of history in inclusion debates in the field of film and audiovisual. So our, as you said, baby steps were really baby steps. They are still. And the approach was soft. We did not put any quotas. We did not do any restrictive, I would say, steps. We only promoted hugely. Every year we have some event public with discussion on gender equality, with our film directors, female, their responses, we invite some guests. So basically it's all about promoting and measuring. So at the end of every year we count, we put it in public, we publish it in our yearly report, the gender data, and this is how I think we came to the point where I strongly believe that there is a lot of talent indeed in everywhere, but is there enough opportunity? And I think this is the main question of funders, that when the industry comes and says, why are you thinking about the gender inclusion? That's not, if they apply, they are treated like every other project. But simply we wanted to motivate young women to get project, to start working, to apply for money. And I can say, after 4 years since this study was published, we have, one simple thing that probably is interesting to everybody, it was to me, is that first female director in Slovenia shot a long feature in 2001. Sweden, 1911, so almost 100 years later. So it's really a different territory. So if you look to this region, this is a totally different story. So today, this is some data that you can follow. It's not so representative because it's maybe it's a small amount of films. It's not the data sometimes, if you don't have the quantity, is a bit strange. But today, at the moment, we have 5 female directors in production, which I'm very proud of, and I think we did motivate them to come and think about, I can be a film director, which was not the case. And in terms of promoting this gender equality in the industry, I've decided to go out with the region together with CineLink. So this year, as you probably know, we are giving for the first time the so-called Female Voices CineLink Award here in Sarajevo, to promote it even regionally, to support with 10,000 euros the best project that promotes and female voices in the development phase of the project. With Tamara, I'm very happy you are my co-juror. So this is basically, we have quite a few successes already with our work, and yes, it's all soft approaches, but I'm very proud that we can now see the results already in 4 years.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And I think that kind of logically brings us to the some considerations from you, Katarina, because it happens that I know that of course you represent Council of Europe here, but it's not only from Strasbourg office that you look at things. You've been head of the mission in Georgia many years ago. You've probably met other female or any kind of gender identified people in different functions, and now you're the head of gender equality unit. Is that yeah? So what are your reactions to what's been discussed here?
Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you so much for including me in this discussion, and yes, I'm very happy to share my impressions as well, at the risk of having imposter syndrome, which is something that women often suffer from. I'm not really from the film industry, but I'm delighted to see gender mainstreaming in action in film. So I'm responsible for gender equality policies at the Council of Europe, 46 member states. And we have, as has already been mentioned, Eurimage as the fund, partial agreement. And it has taken steps recently, joining the bandwagon also on 50-50 by 2020, like a number of funds, but we have also, they have also adopted a gender equality strategy, a new one recently, recognizing that post-Me Too, we don't have enough progress made in spite of the awareness that of sexism in the film in terms of gender parity and lack of gender parity and representation, and also in terms of the content of films themselves. So from my perspective, I just want to refer to the fact that we have an overall Council of Europe gender equality strategy, and the first objective in that strategy is combating sexism and gender stereotypes. And so the work would fall both under that, the work in this area would fall both under that strategic objective, as well as, I would say, the second objective, which is on combating violence against women and domestic violence. I believe we have to make this link and keep reminding audiences, potential filmmakers, the broader public of this link. So, film has this amazing power. I don't have to explain it to you here in the panel or the audience. And there's a great temptation to make use of that power, to harness this power, and it's very, very important that we recognise that measures to promote inclusion and to combat gender inequality should be seen as a strength, not as a weakening of supposed artistic freedom, because gender stereotypes truly undermine freedom. They restrict creativity. They limit women and men and persons who don't identify as either in particular categories and roles, to the point that we don't see that artistic expression. We don't hear those voices that need to be heard, the news voices. And so I just wanted to mention that we have, since 2019, also a recommendation to all member states of the Council of Europe on preventing and combating sexism, and in it there's a section on combating sexism in the media, including film, and a number of measures that are foreseen there, including voluntary reporting. These are examples of measures that could be taken, because different tools that are necessary in this field could go soft, like it was mentioned by Natasha. You could concentrate on awareness raising and voluntary measures, but you can go further, and perhaps the lack of results, the fact that we still see a lot of the male gaze in cinema, we still see so much of this, that perhaps we need to go further. And there are codes of conduct that could be drawn up. There are lots of measures some of which have already been mentioned, that are exciting new measures that could be taken. Some of which go a bit further than than say the soft ones, which are possibly, you know, don't want to. I mean, it's not a criticism of those, especially if they're getting results as well. But sometimes it feels as though the gender stereotypes and the sexism in film content, as well as in the industry, is so pervasive that perhaps more sort of determined and sort of stronger measures might be needed. And so one of the options in our recommendation on sexism is for there to be a clear complaints mechanisms associated with, you know, and consequences for the audiovisual sector and sexism in the audiovisual sector. So if there is a body that a person can complain to, and that content also be, to a certain extent, monitored at least, so that awareness can be raised, but also funding could be linked also as a result of this awareness. Then I think, yeah, these are options that could be explored at least.
Thank you. Neil, you want to add something? Okay.
Just on that point, we're doing, well, not we're doing, in the UK, there is a group which is setting up a body which is separate, where complaints can be made, and then industry will contribute funding, and there will be a proper process that people can go through so that those complaints are investigated, and there's a legal firm involved, so that I'll get you an introduction to the person who's setting that up.
Fatih, I would like to come back to you because, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I have a feeling and a bit of an observation that it all started in audiovisual sector. Maybe you're looking at it with the gender equality agenda in the beginning, and then with baby steps or not, we kind of faced the point when we had to introduce this intersectional view on issues, and I'm not going to go into the full cartography of terminology and trends, but is that something you're observing, and could you maybe explain why it is important to have that gaze?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would also just directly refer actually to these examples because these are basically case studies which actually have also certain challenges. And the BFI is a very good case study. I mean, you're really on a good way. But I think it's also basically, let's say, easier for the BFI because in the UK context, and here I'm coming to the understanding of concepts, and first of all, your language is English, and you have a very Anglo-Saxophonian reference, especially to the discussions which are going in the US, and this you cannot directly translate to the continental Europe context, especially in Sweden. With diversity, I know it's a different topic than, let's say, gender, and Natasha really outlined very well that obviously gender is a very also controversial subject in Slovenia because the national narrative and the national translation of these concepts cannot be immediately basically just imposed from, let's say, the Anglo-Saxophonian discussions. I mean, in Germany it's the same. If you would use the German word for race, it's impossible. So that's why I think so these concepts, as you said, the intersectional approach is very important now, but also it's very important to carefully, with baby steps, try to find an internal common understanding. And what I do now within the European Film Academy is basically to have trainings first with the staff too, because we have a very German staff in Berlin who work for 20 years and now obviously with new faces. And it's also here interesting that my French colleague, who is a person of color, has completely different understanding of diversity and racism than I do, and because of his experience. And also one other challenge, and I think it's in the UK context also a bit easier with data collection, because data collection, especially in the German context and also in the European, is very sensitive. German has so many privacy laws. I mean, Google Street View is banned for a reason in Germany, so you can basically, as a own, if it's your own property, you can basically decide if your house is depicted or not, and other laws too. So, it has something to do also with the whole sensitivity of certain data, especially when I'm thinking about sexual orientation. That's also very, very sensitive. Especially in the Anglo-Saxonian context, as I observed it also from the academic point of view, it's very easy to have already the data when it comes to job applications. And this is something which data collection also in the field of diversity and intersectionality is also very new in the on the European level. I mean, the European Commission started new initiatives on data collection, and certain national governments, and Germany is one of them, started now basically where civil society organizations actually have to monitor and even establish a fair monitoring system with really good standards how to collect data. And that's, I think, very difficult when we talk about Sweden, when we talk also about Slovenia, and UK is a kind of a good model on it because, but I see there obviously the kind of challenge to also, as you mentioned with the concepts, just to translate it from one country to another. Western Europe has definitely much more experiences due to their understanding, which is kind of obviously also due to their histories, and Eastern Europe or Southeast Europe and the European Film Academy comprises also countries like Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, Israel, and Palestine. So they have different understandings of these concepts, and this, I think, we have to respect this, and then also kind of maybe have like certain baby steps, and not like, okay, I'm learning from this person or from this country, and that's the best example, because it's more also to understand and to think, okay, what's possible. And Natasha's examples really shows that she actually, so in Slovenia, it's on a way from one perspective, and now when it comes maybe to another, and also as Kristina kind of outlined it, now there are challenges in the other categories of intersectionality and the characteristics, and I think that's, how we have to respect those categories.
And that's exactly what we wanted to achieve to some extent in the first part of this panel, to see how different the approaches are, and also to be able to talk about it in a very collaborative manner and see, you know, where is the moment, as Kristina said, when one needs to stop maybe for a while and do the housework internally, and then again go out and engage in a sector-wide discussions. So I see myself here as a bridge between you and the panelists. So if anyone has any question, please just give me a sign, and that would be a good place. Sure.
Shall I wait for a microphone? Thank you. Yes, I have. Thank you for all your input. It's really very interesting. I'm based as a producer in Austria, and we just had this next wave of Me Too cases and discussion, and it inspired finally a lot of people to do something now, more concrete than it was before. And I really like what you were always saying about that. I had one thing, what interests me a lot is about the toolkit you were talking about. What kind of toolkit as producer you can really use on the set, because you have to deal with a lot of things. You are responsible actually, and you have to do with, on the one hand, the labor law, and on the other hand, the criminal law. Where are the division? Where's the division? That's for me very important to know. The awareness, the soft things you were talking about is of course very important. So can I force the crew before I start shooting to do an awareness course? These kind of things, I think it should be implemented. I need help from the funds to force people, when I engage them, that they deal with this issue. I want to be everybody that comes on the set to be aware about this. How can I reach out to them? How can I push them towards these things? Yeah, it is also important if something happens which has to do with criminal law. I have to go to the police, yeah? Do I have to stop my shooting? Maybe I have. What do I do? What do the funds do if I have to stop the shooting? Yeah, do they pay me back, or do I have to pay back my money because I'm not finishing the film? We are talking with lawyers about this now, and it's very important to have cases for this and rules for this within national law, of course. But if I have a criminal case, I think I also need a liability clause in the agreements with the people I work with the crew, with the actors. The problem with the actors sometimes is, and we had cases of actors masturbating during the makeup. You don't believe it, yeah? So I need a possibility where we can stop this, where we can stop a shooting, and that we also can go to maybe to the actors and say, hey, you're liable. You are causing the stop of our shooting, so you have to repay the funds. Yeah. So we have to create, let's say, rules or toolkits how we can deal with these kind of cases, and we discuss it within our producers' organizations now how we can handle it. And yeah, I think that's important.
Kristina, would you answer first?
Yeah, I just wanted to give you an example of what happened in Sweden during Me Too, and then I was at the Swedish Film Institute, and we quite quickly started, or not quickly, but after a while, we made up an education. It was called the Green Card. We talked about it the other night. It totally exploded. People got furious. The reason was purely education and information from professional people talking about different aspects of Me Too. And also for us to know that the producers that we were actually giving out quite a lot of money to were informed and had an idea and had started a discussion and make them think about what could they do within their companies. Anyways, that education went on for a couple of, it's not a big country, so sooner or later everyone had done it. But then the Producers Guild themselves made up a similar education. I think they still have it actually. And it's an introduction on all the fields that you mentioned, almost all of them, because new producers show up all the time and they need to get the education. So they actually did that program themselves, which of course was the best thing to happen. But yeah, feelings involved again.
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the CEO of a company is responsible for the safety of the people they employ. And on sets, I think producers sometimes lose sight of that. They're very happy to hire a work health safety officer to oversee stunts, and producers, to avoid liability, should do the same in terms of the safety of the workplace. And I think the mechanisms that need to be put in place are probably not too complicated. They will add an additional burden in terms of administration and follow-through and training, and that's what we're looking at the BFI. Coming out of the skills review, we're about to fund a production toolkit to professionalise HR. We're working out what that looks like. We're going to make that publicly available. You know, there'll be training modules, which, for instance, Screen Skills already delivers around unconscious bias, but we need to do something a bit more precise for production. Like you, unless you've done these courses, then if you potentially are funded by the BFI, then you're not going to be able to be employed by those productions. They're the kind of policies that we probably do need to be put in place. An organisation where somebody can go to be properly investigated, so that it is clear and transparent, like HR in big corporations bring in people who then investigate claims, and then that's done properly. And I think this commitment to it is essential, because ultimately there's also this moral obligation as a producer. Your values are defined by the behaviours you walk past and ignore. So somebody sitting, the example you gave, knowing that happened and ignoring it, those values are not the values that we want to fund at the BFI. So I think sometimes the excuses of, we don't know what to do, we don't have the toolkit, we don't know, is hiding, perhaps, because of the nature of production, it's so quick, there's a lot of turnover, you're having to hire things change immediately. It can become a bit of a defensive excuse for not genuinely engaging with the obligation of the producer, which is to protect the people who work for them.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions in the room? No. Okay, then we still have a couple of more minutes, and I would like to ask you, Kristina, what is like the main challenge you are facing when, you know, looking into the thinking curve of the diversity agenda internally in the film Väst right now? Something that comes first in your mind?
Yeah, It's connected to a report that some of you might have read or seen that has been done by Väst. It's called Film Funding at a Crossroads. And it's about the relevance of film funding. How should the funds stay relevant in this landscape where there are so many global platforms and so much other money? And it's a great report. You can download it from our website. But anyhow, within that discussion, I think that the biggest issue here is that we are too slow. We don't follow the industry any longer. They are ahead of us. And that's, thank you very much, the global platforms actually. And the immense, I mean the productions, the hours that are being made all over Europe and the world. And the idea of who is the customer, what do we want to show, who is watching. And I think the funds now are really, they need to be quick. We are in a better place, the Film Väst, because we're a small organization. We can move quickly and change, but I think like any of the Scandinavian film institutes, they have a hard time keeping up the pace with the changes.
And Natasha, will you agree to that, or you are facing some other major challenge in Slovenia?
Definitely, I would agree. And also from the territories where I come, at least in my country, funds being slow following the industry. We also have reasons why this is so, because of the legal environment that we are like not so independent as we should be, following the industry with the fast track that the industry goes. We still have so many elements where we so much depend on the political umbrella, so to say, that it's even harder for us. Maybe for regional funds, where Kristina comes from, it's really more flexible, more adaptable, more quick. But for national funds in countries where I come from, it's really like the industry is far ahead, and we are like with small steps behind, changing the legal basis, so it's, yes, we cannot follow simply. It's very hard to follow, and we need, at least in this region, much more independence to be following the industry as we should.
And Neil, for the BFI, I would like to have an answer about the challenge specifically linked to the inclusion and diversity strategies that you have in place. What is like the biggest thing that you're facing with your team in that?
I think it's a major cultural shift that's going to have to happen, which policy isn't going to be enough to address. And I think that's something which is going to take years for people to understand why it's important. And actually, conversations with producers I've had, there was one Me Too incident which happened last year. This returning series was basically cancelled because of it, and it had taken 10 years to get to the place where they were about to get into, you know, a decent spot where they were going to make money out of it, and they didn't address the behavior of the actor in series 1, and because of that, they've now lost everything. And I think this is a way to demonstrate that there is a commercial liability that you'll be carrying if we don't make this cultural change. And the other thing is, you know, you bring new people into the industry who come from a Gen Z background, and they look at boomers shouting at each other on a set and behaving badly, and they then go and work for Google, and they work for organizations that have considered this, and we'll lose talent. And that's really kind of something we have to think about very seriously.
Fatih, are we going to expect some changes coming out of the European Film Academy? Are you cooking some internal strategies now?
Well, I'm still at the very beginning, because first of all, you have to analyze the situation, and you have to find out what are the main challenges. I mean, we mentioned already a lot of them today at this panel. And then obviously it's also very, very important to have internally, obviously, a discussion, but then also externally to find basically the balance between how quick you can actually adapt to these changes. And I mean, Europe, it's very, very complex in a way, because, I mean, it's diverse, so, but then also What we are also, obviously, last year, Bosnia won the best movie, and also the director, and that's already showing maybe a kind of changing the shift or the gaze to bit to certain regions, and especially like also marginalized regions like Scandinavia and also Slovenia, like countries where basically within the film industry, or that basically they do not maybe get a lot of recognition compared to other countries which are dominating the European film, especially Western Europe. And there I think it's just important to kind of include these new perspectives and voices. And now we have to see, we're coming with a strategy plan by the end of the year after this analysis, because what I'm doing also now, I'm basically observing all the selection meetings when it comes to awarding procedures, but also that's an internal discussion, but then also externally to kind of promote diversity and inclusion on a European level to find a common language and understanding, because as we saw on the panel, different national narratives and also politics. I mean, Slovenia has for sure a government which is also very hindering certain works, and Germany now changed because Germany changed just the government and has a very, very diversity, progressive. I mean, it's basically really one of the main agendas in German politics after Merkel to kind of really go for the inclusive strategy.
Well, you have just inspired me to close on a note which will be a bit more positive, because I think we have to, the talent exists everywhere in this industry, I believe. It's not only on the side of the industry, but the talented people are running film funds and advocating for change, and then bringing in also the new actions and acting on them. And you just mentioned, and I think you meant a film by Kivadis Aida, the one that won. It's of course a Bosnian director, but if I'm not wrong, it's a film that was co-produced by 6 or 7 countries, and that is what we are all good on, like bringing together effort, creativity, talent, and making those stories work out and, you know, debate and bring them to the audiences. And that's why I personally love where I am in this industry. And I think that the challenges are different, but if we are there with a joint effort, that on a different pace, but a positive change can be achieved. And I'm not sure of your national race criteria, but we've been extremely efficient here. We had 1 hour, and because you've been so specific in your interventions, we're just right on time. So thank you very much for your input, and see you later in another editions of our talks in Sarajevo, but also in other festivals. Thanks.